My teacher called at midnight. Your parents aren't coming back. Pack a bag and meet me outside. So I did. I was shoving clothes into my backpack when the reality of Miss Cross's words finally hit me. My parents weren't coming back from Philadelphia. Not delayed, not staying an extra day, not coming back at all. Miss Adriana Cross had been my English teacher for 2 years and had never called me at home, never contacted me outside school hours, never used the urgent tone that had just pulled me from sleep 30 seconds ago. She'd said I had 15 minutes to pack essentials and meet her 2 blocks away at the corner of Oakmont and 5th. She'd said not to call anyone, not to tell anyone, not to turn on lights that might alert neighbors. I grabbed my laptop, phone charger, and the cash I'd been saving from summer jobs, $800 in 20s, hidden in my desk drawer. My hands shook as I opened my father's study and found my birth certificate and social security card in the filing cabinet, documents I'd never touched but suddenly seemed critical. The house felt wrong in the darkness, full of shadows that hadn't existed yesterday when this was still my normal life. My parents had left for Philadelphia 3 days ago for what they called an administrative conference at some private school consortium. My father was director of admissions at Whitmore Academy, and my mother managed student records, positions that required discretion about wealthy families and their children. They'd been vague about the trip details, but that was normal for them, always careful about confidentiality and professional boundaries. They'd called once the first night to say they'd arrived safely, then nothing for 2 days, which I'd assumed meant they were busy with meetings. Now Miss Cross was telling me they weren't coming home, and I needed to leave immediately. I zipped my backpack and looked around my bedroom one last time, at the posters and books and normal life of a 15-year-old boy who'd gone to bed thinking tomorrow would be another ordinary day. That version of my life was ending in this midnight moment, and some instinct told me I wouldn't see this room again. I climbed out my window onto the porch roof and dropped into the backyard, avoiding the front door where motion sensor lights might expose me. The walk to Oakmont and 5th took 8 minutes through residential streets, where every house was dark and silent. October air bit through my hoodie and I kept my head down, watching from Miss Cross's car while trying to understand what emergency would make my English teacher call me at midnight with instructions to run. Her silver sedan was parked under a broken streetlight, engine running, and she leaned across to push open the passenger door when she saw me. I climbed in, and she pulled away immediately, checking mirrors obsessively, taking random turns through neighborhoods I recognized but couldn't track directionally. Her face was pale in the dashboard light, and she kept gripping the steering wheel too tight. "I know you have questions," she said. "I'll explain everything once we're safely away from your house and anyone who might be watching it. For now, just know that your parents discovered something at Whitmore Academy that powerful people needed to stay hidden. They're not coming back because they can't come back, and you're in danger because of what they found." Her words made no sense. Whitmore Academy was an elite private school for the children of politicians, executives, and old money families. It had been around for 90 years, with an impeccable reputation for academic excellence and character development. My parents had worked there for 12 years, since before I was born, dedicated to the institution and its mission. What could they possibly have discovered that would make them not come back? Miss Cross drove for 30 minutes before pulling into a rest stop off the highway, parking in the darkest corner away from the bathrooms and vending machines. She turned to face me, and her expression was devastated. "Your parents found evidence that Whitmore Academy has been operating an abuse network for decades. Faculty, staff, and administrators systematically grooming and exploiting students from wealthy families, then using that exploitation to blackmail the families into silence and compliance. Your father discovered financial records showing payments to victims' families disguised as scholarship funds. Your mother found personnel files documenting complaints that were buried rather than investigated." I stared at Miss Cross, my brain refusing to process what she was saying. Abuse network, systematic exploitation, decades. These were words that belonged to news stories about distant scandals, not to the prestigious school where I'd attended since kindergarten, where I'd been a student for 10 years alongside children of senators and CEOs. Miss Cross pulled out a flash drive from her jacket pocket. "Your parents copied everything they found and sent it to me 3 days ago with instructions to get you to safety if they didn't return. They were planning to go to federal authorities in Philadelphia to meet with investigators who handle institutional abuse cases. But someone at Whitmore found out what they'd discovered. Your parents never made it to that meeting. Their hotel room was found empty yesterday morning with signs of struggle. The Philadelphia police are calling it a missing persons case, but I know it's connected to what they uncovered. The people running this network have protected it for decades. They have resources, connections, and they're willing to eliminate threats." My hands were numb, and my chest felt tight. My parents were missing. Not at a conference, not delayed, but actually missing with signs of struggle. And Miss Cross was saying they'd been disappeared by powerful people connected to my school because they'd found evidence of abuse. I asked her why she was involved, why my parents had sent this information to her. She looked away, her jaw clenched. "Because I'm a survivor of this network. 20 years ago, I was a student at Whitmore. I was 14 when a teacher started grooming me, telling me I was special, creating situations where we were alone together. It progressed to abuse that continued for 2 years until I graduated and escaped. I never reported it because I was terrified and ashamed, and the teacher was beloved by everyone. But your parents found my name in old files, found records of complaints I'd made to administrators that were dismissed. They contacted me 6 months ago, asking if I'd be willing to tell my story as part of an investigation. She was crying now, tears running down her face in the dim parking lot light. I said yes because I've spent 20 years knowing that what happened to me probably happened to others, that the system that protected my abuser was still protecting abusers now. Your parents spent months gathering evidence, documenting patterns, identifying victims. They found at least 30 cases over 4 decades where students reported abuse, and administrators covered it up, paid families to stay quiet, protected faculty members by moving them to different positions rather than firing them. It's institutional, coordinated, systematic, and your parents were going to expose all of it. She handed me the flash drive. This is a copy of everything they found. Personnel files, financial records, victim statements, internal memos about damage control. It's evidence of criminal conspiracy spanning decades. We need to get this to federal investigators who can actually do something with it. But first, we need to keep you alive. The reality of danger finally penetrated my shock. If powerful people had made my parents disappear to protect this network, they'd certainly target me, the son of the whistleblowers, someone who might have been told secrets or given evidence. I asked Miss Cross where we were going, and she said she'd been in contact with an attorney who specialized in institutional abuse cases, someone who'd handled prosecutions of schools and churches and youth organizations. He was 3 hours away in Cleveland and had agreed to meet us at dawn. But Miss Cross was terrified we wouldn't make it that far, that someone from Whitmore had already realized my parents had a son who might be a liability. She'd left her own apartment knowing she might not be able to go back, that helping me meant painting a target on herself. I asked her why she'd risk this, and she looked at me with devastation and determination mixed together. Because I was 15 when no one protected me, and I won't let what happened to me happen to you or anyone else if I can prevent it. We drove through the night on back roads, avoiding highways where we might be easier to track. Miss Cross explained that my parents had been meticulous in their investigation, careful not to alert anyone at Whitmore about what they were uncovering. But someone had noticed, either through their computer access, or their questions, or some small mistake that tipped off the wrong person. The last message she'd received from my father came 3 days ago from Philadelphia, saying they had a meeting scheduled with federal investigators for the following morning and would call her after it was completed. They never called. Miss Cross had tried reaching them for 48 hours before calling hotel, and then the police, who confirmed they were missing. She'd debated whether to go to the police herself with the evidence, but my father's instructions had been explicit. If something happened to him and my mother, she was to get me to safety first, and then deliver the evidence to the attorney in Cleveland, who could navigate federal prosecution without local interference. I asked Miss Cross why she thought I was in danger specifically, and she pulled into an empty parking lot, showing me her phone. There were text messages from a blocked number, sent starting 6 hours ago. We know where the boy lives. We know his school schedule, his friends, his routines. Tell us what the parents sent you, and maybe everyone walks away from this. She'd ignored the messages, blocked the number, but 3 more blocked numbers had sent similar threats. Someone was actively hunting for the evidence, and knew that I was a connection to my parents, and potentially to whatever they'd uncovered. Miss Cross had made the decision to get me out before they moved from threats to action. She'd driven to my house at midnight and made the call that pulled me from normal life into this nightmare. I wanted to disbelieve everything, to insist this was paranoid overreaction to my parents being temporarily out of contact. But the text messages were real, the flash drive was real, and Miss Cross's tears when she talked about being abused at 14 were devastatingly real. Cleveland was still 2 hours away when headlights appeared behind us, matching our speed, following through turns. Miss Cross noticed, and her breathing changed, became faster and shallower. She accelerated, and the headlights accelerated. She took a sudden exit, and the vehicle followed. We were being tracked, actively pursued by someone who'd figured out where we were and where we were going. Miss Cross was gripping the steering wheel so hard her knuckles were white. She told me to call 911 and report that we were being followed by someone who'd threatened us, to give our location and direction. I made the call, and the dispatcher asked questions I could barely answer while watching the headlights in the side mirror getting closer. Miss Cross tried every evasive tactic she could think of, turning randomly, speeding through yellow lights, taking service roads. The vehicle stayed with us, close enough now that I could see it was a black SUV with tinted windows. We were on a rural road with no traffic and no streetlights when the SUV accelerated and rammed us from behind. Miss Cross screamed and fought to control the car as we swerved across lanes. The SUV hit us again, harder, and something in the rear of our car crunched. Miss Cross was crying and praying under her breath, accelerating as fast as her sedan could manage, but the SUV was more powerful and driven by someone with no concern for our safety. They rammed us a third time and we spun out, rotating across the road before slamming into a ditch. The impact threw me against the seatbelt hard enough to knock the air from my lungs. Miss Cross's head hit the driver's window with a sound that made me sick. The SUV stopped on the road above us, doors opening, figures climbing out. I grabbed Miss Cross's shoulder and shook her. She was dazed, bleeding from a cut on her forehead, but conscious. I pulled the flash drive from her pocket and shoved it deep into my jeans, then grabbed my backpack from the rear seat. The figures were walking down the embankment toward our crashed car, two men in dark clothing moving with purpose. Miss Cross fumbled with her seatbelt and I helped her release it, then pushed open my door and pulled her out. We ran into the wooded area alongside the road, crashing through brush and darkness, while the men shouted behind us. I could hear them clearly now, coordinating, one going left and one going right to flank us. Miss Cross was stumbling, still disoriented from hitting her head, and I had to half carry her deeper into the trees. Branches whipped my face and roots tried to trip me, but I kept moving, dragging Miss Cross forward by her arm. Behind us, flashlight beams cut through the darkness, sweeping back and forth, searching. One of the men was shouting for us to stop, saying they just wanted to talk, that no one needed to get hurt. But they'd just run us off the road deliberately. Their intentions were clear. We made it maybe half a mile before Miss Cross collapsed, her legs giving out. She was crying and apologizing, saying she couldn't run anymore, that her head was spinning too badly. I pulled out my phone to call 911 again, but there was no signal in the dense woods. The flashlight beams were getting closer, voices shouting to each other about our location. I made a decision I'd regret later or not live to regret at all. I told Miss Cross to stay hidden, to curl up behind a fallen log, and stay absolutely silent. I took off running in a different direction, making noise deliberately, drawing the men away from her. I crashed through brush loudly enough that they'd hear me over their own movement. The flashlight beam swung in my direction, and I heard the men changing course, pursuing the noise I was making. I ran harder, putting distance between them and Miss Cross, leading them deeper into the woods while she had a chance to hide or recover enough to move again. I ran for what felt like hours, but was probably 20 minutes before I had to stop, my lungs burning and my legs shaking. I crouched behind a massive oak tree, trying to control my breathing enough to listen for pursuit. I could hear them still, closer than I wanted, moving methodically through the woods. One of them was on a phone giving updates to someone, describing our escape and asking for instructions. The voice I heard said something about the boy having the evidence and not letting him reach authorities. They knew I had the flash drive. Somehow, they knew. I pressed myself against the tree trunk and tried to think through options. I couldn't run forever. I couldn't hide indefinitely. I needed to get to a road, find help, contact police or the attorney in Cleveland or anyone who could intervene. But I was 15 years old in the woods at night being hunted by adults, willing to kill to protect a decades-old abuse network. The flashlight beam swept past my tree and I held my breath, praying they wouldn't look closer. One of the men was maybe 30 feet away, moving slowly, shining his light into every shadow and behind every large trunk. He was speaking into his phone again. The teacher's probably injured from the crash. She won't get far. The kid's the priority. He's got the files. Once we secure those, we can deal with both of them permanently. The casual way he discussed murdering us made my stomach turn. These weren't random thugs. These were people connected to Whitmore Academy, possibly administrators or security personnel, doing the work of protecting an institution that had systematically abused children for 40 years. My parents had found proof of that abuse, and now they were missing. Miss Cross had tried to save me, and now she was hurt and hiding in the woods. And I was holding the evidence that could expose everything if I could survive long enough to get it to someone who mattered. I waited until the man moved past my position, then I ran in the opposite direction, trying to circle back toward where we'd crashed. If I could get to the road, I might be able to flag down a passing car or find a house or business with a phone. The woods seemed endless in the darkness, every direction looking the same, no landmarks I could use to navigate. I was completely lost, running blind through trees and undergrowth, when I finally burst out onto a road. Not the same road where we'd crashed, somewhere different, a two-lane highway with no lights and no traffic visible in either direction. I stood on the shoulder trying to decide which direction to run when headlights appeared in the distance. I stepped into the road, waving my arms, desperate for help. The vehicle slowed, and I saw it was a pickup truck, an older man behind the wheel with a confused expression. I ran to his window as he rolled it down. "Please, I need help. 2 men are chasing me through the woods. They ran my teacher's car off the road. I need you to call the police." The man looked at me with concern and suspicion mixed together, probably trying to determine if I was a legitimate victim or some kind of trouble. He pulled out his phone and asked me what happened. I explained in a rush about Miss Cross and the crash and the men pursuing us, leaving out the details about abuse networks and evidence because that sounded insane. I said someone was trying to hurt us and we needed police immediately. The man called 911 while I stood by his truck watching the tree line, expecting the men to emerge at any moment. The dispatcher told him police were already en route to a reported assault on this highway, responding to the earlier 911 call Miss Cross had made. The man offered to wait with me until they arrived, and I almost cried with relief. Police cars appeared 10 minutes later, lights flashing, multiple units responding to what they thought was a vehicular assault. I explained everything to officers who looked increasingly skeptical as my story progressed from car chase to crash to men hunting us through woods. They asked where the other vehicle was, and I pointed back toward the woods where we'd left Miss Cross's crashed car. They asked where my teacher was, and I said she was hiding in the woods, injured, that I'd led the men away from her. They asked who was chasing us, and I said people connected to Whitmore Academy, who didn't want evidence of crimes exposed. The lead officer's expression changed when I mentioned Whitmore. He knew the school, knew its reputation, and looked suddenly uncomfortable. He asked what kind of evidence, and I pulled out the flash drive, explaining that my parents had uncovered an abuse network and disappeared after trying to report it to federal authorities. The officer took the flash drive, examining it, and I watched his face carefully, trying to determine if he was going to help or if he was compromised. He told other officers to search the woods for Miss Cross and the men I'd described, then took me to sit in his patrol car while he made phone calls. I could hear fragments of his conversation, words like institutional abuse and federal jurisdiction, and need to escalate immediately. He was talking to supervisors, getting instructions, dealing with something way above normal police response. 20 minutes later, they'd found Miss Cross stumbling out of the woods, disoriented and bleeding but alive. She saw me in the patrol car and broke down, sobbing with relief that I'd made it out. Paramedics checked her head injury and insisted on taking her to the hospital for evaluation. She grabbed my hand before they loaded her into the ambulance. "Don't let them bury this. Your parents died trying to expose these people. Don't let their deaths be meaningless." The officer heard her and his expression hardened. He assured her that the evidence would be handled properly, that federal investigators would be contacted, that we'd both be protected. But I didn't trust him, couldn't trust him. Because Miss Cross was right that powerful people had protected this network for decades, and local police could be compromised by those same connections. I asked the officer directly if he had any relationship with Whitmore Academy, if his children attended, or if he knew administrators personally. He looked uncomfortable and admitted his daughter had graduated from Whitmore 5 years ago, that he'd served on the parent advisory board during her time there. The conflict of interest was obvious. I asked to speak to someone from outside the local jurisdiction, someone with no connections to the school or the community. The officer was offended, but he made the call, contacting state police and explaining the situation. They arrived an hour later, taking custody of me and the flash drive, promising to coordinate with federal investigators who handled institutional abuse cases. The state police detective who took my statement was a woman named Lieutenant Shaw, with sharp eyes and an expression that suggested she'd heard too many stories about institutions protecting abusers. She listened to everything, recorded my account, examined the flash drive, and told me this was bigger than a local case, that federal prosecutors would need to be involved given the decades of conspiracy and the interstate implications of families from multiple states. She asked about my parents, and I had to say I didn't know where they were, that they'd been missing for 3 days after discovering this evidence. Lieutenant Shaw's expression told me she didn't expect them to be found alive, that people who disappeared after uncovering this level of corruption rarely came back. I asked her directly if she thought my parents were dead, and she was quiet before answering honestly. "I think they were eliminated as threats, but until we have evidence of that, I'll proceed as if they're missing and potentially recoverable." The FBI took over the investigation within 24 hours. They moved me to a safe house with protective custody, interviewed me for hours about everything I knew or had observed growing up at Whitmore Academy. They wanted details about faculty, administrators, patterns of behavior, students who'd seemed troubled or had suddenly left the school. I told them everything I could remember, trying to piece together a decade of attending an institution that now appeared to have been corrupt to its core. The FBI examined the flash drive and confirmed it contained extensive evidence of systematic abuse, cover-ups, financial payments to silence victims, and coordination among multiple administrators to protect perpetrators. They said it was one of the most comprehensively documented cases of institutional abuse they'd seen, that my parents had essentially built a prosecutable case before they disappeared. The evidence showed at least 43 victims over 4 decades, some of whom had been paid settlements in exchange for non-disclosure agreements, others who'd simply been dismissed and gaslit when they reported abuse. Miss Cross was also in protective custody, recovering from her head injury and giving her own detailed account of being abused as a student 20 years ago. The FBI found her name in the files my parents had compiled, along with the complaints she'd made to administrators that were buried rather than investigated. Her abuser was still teaching at Whitmore, still in a position of authority over children, because the system had protected him when she was 14. The FBI arrested him within 48 hours, along with 6 other faculty members and 3 administrators who'd been documented in the evidence as either perpetrators or accomplices in cover-ups. The arrests made national news. Prestigious private school abuse scandal. Elite institution faces federal investigation. Dozens of victims spanning decades. The headlines captured the scope, but couldn't convey the devastation of betrayed trust and stolen childhoods. My parents' bodies were found 5 days after the investigation went public. They'd been discovered in a storage facility outside Philadelphia, killed execution style, their deaths staged to look like a robbery gone wrong. The FBI said the murders were clearly professional hits coordinated by people with resources and connections. They arrested the 2 men who'd chased Miss Cross and me through the woods, both former security personnel at Whitmore Academy who'd been paid to eliminate the threat my parents represented. Under interrogation, one of them confessed that they'd been hired by Whitmore's headmaster to prevent the evidence from reaching federal authorities. The headmaster was arrested and charged with conspiracy to commit murder in addition to his role in the abuse network. The arrests expanded to include board members who'd known about abuse and actively worked to conceal it, maintaining the school's reputation at the expense of victimized children. The trial took 18 months. I was required to testify about finding the evidence, and about the night Miss Cross called me, about being hunted through the woods by men trying to prevent the truth from emerging. Miss Cross testified about her abuse 20 years ago, and about the administrators who'd dismissed her complaints. 41 other victims came forward, people who'd been students at Whitmore over 4 decades, all of them describing patterns of grooming, exploitation, and institutional betrayal. The jury heard about financial settlements paid to buy silence, about perpetrators being quietly moved to different positions rather than fired, about board members who'd known and chosen reputation over child safety. The evidence my parents had compiled was presented in devastating detail, showing a sophisticated system designed to protect abusers and punish anyone who threatened exposure. 18 people were convicted, including the headmaster, 3 board members, 7 faculty members, and the 2 men who'd killed my parents. Sentences ranged from 15 years to life without parole. Whitmore Academy closed permanently. The scandal destroyed its reputation beyond recovery, and financial settlements to victims bankrupted the institution. The campus was sold and demolished, the name removed from every building and document. The legacy of 90 years erased because that legacy had been built on systematic abuse of vulnerable children. I watched the demolition from a distance, standing with Miss Cross, who'd become my legal guardian after my parents' deaths. She'd fought for custody, despite having no biological relationship to me, arguing that my parents had trusted her enough to send me to her in crisis and that continuing that trust honored their memory. The court agreed, and I moved into her small apartment, starting therapy to process the trauma of losing both parents and learning that my entire childhood had been spent at an institution that preyed on students. 5 years later, I'm 20 and studying criminal justice, planning to work in prosecuting institutional abuse cases. Miss Cross teaches at a different school now, one with actual oversight and accountability, one where students know they can report problems without being dismissed or silenced. She still has nightmares about what was done to her when she was 14, still carries trauma that therapy helps manage but can't erase. We both live with the knowledge that my parents died, exposing monsters who'd operated freely for decades. But those monsters are in prison now, their institution destroyed, and dozens of victims finally heard and believed. The ending isn't happy because my parents are dead and Miss Cross was abused, and 43 people had childhood stolen. But it's justice, incomplete and bittersweet, won at terrible cost by 2 people who chose truth over safety. My teacher called at midnight 5 years ago and told me my parents weren't coming back. She was right. But what they found before they disappeared brought down an empire built on suffering, and that matters. If you enjoyed this, you'll definitely want to see the next ones too. So subscribe now and let me know your take in the comments.